I always thought flirting was harmless. Just a joke. A little spark tossed into the air to make someone smile. I never thought someone would take it seriously. It started on a Tuesday, in the bookstore where I work part-time. Rain had left the sidewalk slick, and the air inside smelled faintly of wet jackets and old paper. She was there before the morning crowd, leaning against the counter with that quiet confidence that made you notice her without trying. Mid-40s, maybe, hair streaked with gray but cut sharp and precise. Eyes that seemed like they'd memorized the world in ways I couldn't begin to match. I don't even remember what I said at first. Something about the new display of poetry books, my voice a little too loud, a little too eager. She tilted her head, eyebrow arched, and smiled. Not indulgent, not polite, but something that made the air shift. That was the first time I realized she noticed me. We talked in fits and starts after that. I made jokes I thought were harmless. She laughed, soft, the kind of laugh that lingers longer than you expect. Her hands moved as she talked, brushing her hair behind her ear, tracing the edge of the counter like she owned the space. I remember catching her glance when I reached for a book she had paused over. A flicker, almost invisible, but it made my chest tighten. There was a pause once, mid-conversation, the kind where words hang and you start noticing the little things. The way her ring caught the morning light, the faint scent of coffee that clung to her sweater, the soft click of her shoes as she shifted weight from one foot to the other. I tried to smile, said something, anything, but she didn't answer right away. Just watched me. And in that moment, I could have sworn she was looking through me. She left that day with a small nod, and I kept staring at the doorway long after she was gone, replaying the tilt of her head, the slight curve of her smile. There was something electric about it, something I didn't understand but couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing. Flirting, just flirting. But later, in the quiet of the stockroom, I found myself tracing the lines of her handwriting on a note she'd left me. Just a reminder about the new shipment of books. Her script was precise, tidy, almost unyielding, yet the way she'd looped the Y in her name made it feel personal, intimate, like a secret meant for me. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way her eyes lingered on mine that morning. Not the polite linger of a stranger, but something else, something patient, waiting, assessing. I couldn't stop thinking about it because I couldn't figure out what it meant. I wanted to, more than I wanted to admit. Even now, days later, I catch myself replaying the way she moved between the shelves, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the quiet insistence in her presence. And it's ridiculous, because we barely know each other. But I'm starting to wonder, if flirting for fun can feel like this, what does it mean when someone takes it seriously? It was another rainy Thursday, and I found myself arranging the new hardcover arrivals when she appeared in the doorway again. She carried a tote bag heavy enough to slouch her shoulders, and I realized for the first time just how small moments of fatigue could make someone magnetic. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. My voice caught somewhere between friendly and intrusive. She looked up, and for a second her usual composure cracked. A flicker, almost imperceptible, like a shadow passing over her face. She gave me a half-smile, eyes darting past me as if she weren't sure she wanted to be noticed. "You always put these in the same spot," she said softly, nodding toward the poetry display. I wasn't sure if it was a complaint or an observation, but I smiled anyway. I offered to help her carry a stack of books to the counter. She hesitated, a flick of her hand signaling both acceptance and resistance, like she didn't quite know if she wanted me to notice her struggle. The moment stretched. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as I lifted the top book, and the air between us tightened. Not a spark, exactly, more like a low hum I could feel in my chest. I noticed everything. The way her knuckles were slightly red from the cold, the faint crease of fatigue under her eyes, the delicate tilt of her head as she tried to read the spines of the books without looking directly at me. She laughed softly at something I muttered, a laugh that felt fragile, careful, like it might break if handled roughly. "Thanks," she said, voice low, almost vulnerable. I wanted to press, to ask for what, but I didn't. I just let the silence linger, letting the unspoken pulse between us fill the quiet corners of the shop. For a moment, she leaned against the counter, and I realized she hadn't done that to anyone else that morning. Not customers, not colleagues, just me. And it struck me that maybe, in some small way, she trusted me with this, her tiredness, her hesitation, the faint trace of her vulnerability. I didn't know what to say. I shouldn't say anything. I just offered her the books, our hands brushing again, lingering longer than needed. Her gaze caught mine this time, holding, hesitant but steady, as if weighing something she couldn't put into words. And then she smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling in a way that made the room feel warmer, even though the rain pelted against the windows outside. She gave me a small nod, turned, and started toward the door. I wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to say something that would make her stop, but I didn't. I just watched, feeling that gentle pull again, the kind you can't name but recognize instantly. And as she left, the air seemed to linger where she had been, charged, heavy, leaving me with one thought I couldn't shake. Even from across the room, even with nothing said, she had found a way to leave me wanting more. It was close to midnight, the bookstore long empty except for the hum of the overhead lights and the rain drumming against the windows. She had stayed behind, sorting through the returns, and somehow, I'd ended up lingering too. Neither of us had said we were staying late. It just happened, like the world had shrunk to this small room and the sound of our own breathing. I carried a box of returned novels across the floor, careful not to bump into her. She glanced up as I passed, and for a fraction of a second, our eyes locked in a way that made me pause. Her hair had fallen loose from its usual neat twist, brushing her shoulders, and the light caught the gray streaks in it. I noticed the tension in her jaw, the way she pressed her lips together before she looked away. I tried to speak, but my words stumbled. "Do you need a hand with?" She shook her head, faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. The small vulnerability made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, wanted to brush a stray lock of hair from her face or steady the box she held, but I didn't. The line between help and intrusion felt impossibly thin. The silence stretched, only broken by the occasional rustle of paper and the steady rhythm of the rain. Then her phone buzzed, the screen illuminating her face. I saw the name flash, someone from her past, I guessed, and a brief shadow passed across her expression. She sighed, fingers hovering over the screen before she let it go, as if she didn't want to be pulled back into that world tonight. I wanted to say something, something that mattered, but every instinct screamed restraint. I knew her life wasn't mine to interrupt, yet the closer she got, the more I felt tethered to her presence. I felt it in the small brush of her hand when she reached for a misplaced book, the way her elbow bumped mine by accident. Sparks? Maybe. Or just a cruel trick of proximity. I tried to focus on the task at hand, arranging the returns, but my eyes kept drifting to her. The way she worked, methodical, precise, yet somehow there was softness in her movements that made the air between us hum. I imagined saying the words I shouldn't. I like you. I think about you more than I should. But the words remained locked in my throat. For a heartbeat, she looked up at me again, and we stood there, only a few feet apart, the rain outside drumming like a distant heartbeat. I thought about reaching for her hand, just a brush, a spark, but stopped myself, frozen. She leaned slightly toward the counter, unaware, or pretending to be, and the box in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The moment ended before it could even begin. She turned to put a book back on the shelf, and I exhaled silently, feeling the weight of all the words we didn't say. But even as she moved away, the warmth of her proximity lingered. It was one of those nights you remember not for what happened, but for what almost did. And for the rest of the walk home, all I could think about was how close I had been, and how impossibly far it felt. We ended up in the small cafe down the street, a place that smelled faintly of burnt sugar and wet leather. The rain had let up, leaving the streets slick and reflective. I'd followed her there without thinking. Somehow, the walk felt necessary, like neither of us could go home yet. We sat across from each other in a booth, the table too small for all the books she'd brought in a tote. Steam curled from our cups, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was electric, heavy, the kind that presses into your chest without mercy. I watched her fingers trace the rim of her mug, slow, deliberate, almost nervous. She hadn't noticed that I noticed. Her eyes kept flicking to mine, then away, then back again, like she was measuring something she couldn't name. Finally, she broke the silence, voice low, almost brittle. "What are we doing?" I froze, unsure how to answer. I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to say everything. Instead, I let my eyes meet hers, searching, trying to convey that I didn't know either. She exhaled, shoulders slumping slightly, a rare crack in her composed facade. "This, whatever this is, it's confusing. And maybe it shouldn't be. But it feels like we're pretending, and I can't anymore." I felt my own chest tighten, words tangling. I wanted to reassure her, to make some kind of promise, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there and let the tension hum between us, loud and unyielding. Her gaze softened in a way that made my stomach twist, part longing, part fear. "I think about you," she admitted, barely a whisper. "Not in a casual way. And I hate that I do." I swallowed, heart pounding, aware of every little detail. The line of her jaw, the quiet tremor in her hands, the way her hair caught the light from the cafe window. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but I hesitated. Because touching her wouldn't solve anything. It would only make the confusion worse. We sat there, not moving, the world around us fading into a dull blur. I noticed how her shoulders carried an invisible weight, how her eyes seemed both distant and unguarded at once. And then she leaned back slightly, looking at me with something like fear and honesty mingled together. "I don't know if we're allowed to feel this," she said, voice breaking just enough to make me flinch. "And I don't know if I want to stop. But I can't. I can't pretend anymore." The words hung in the air, suffocating, impossibly heavy. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we could figure it out, that nothing had to change. But I stayed silent, letting the quiet answer, because silence had never spoken louder than it did right now. She looked away, a tremor in her lips, and whispered almost to herself, "I don't want to ruin anything. But maybe I already have." And in that moment, I realized neither of us could go back to the way things were. I was shelving books late that evening when she appeared again, carrying a small, worn envelope. It looked like it had been through a few decades, corners frayed, handwriting slightly faded. I raised an eyebrow, and she gave a half-smile, that quiet, guarded kind that made you lean in without thinking. "I found this in my mother's old desk," she said softly, sliding it across the counter toward me. It's from someone I loved a long time ago." I hesitated, unsure if I should touch it, unsure if I even wanted to know. But curiosity, and something deeper, something I couldn't name, won. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded letter, words looping across the page with a tenderness that made my chest ache. She watched me, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the counter. I noticed the faint tremor, the way her lips pressed together, and the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine. She'd said little, but her presence spoke volumes. I thought I was over him," she said after a pause, voice low, almost a whisper. "But sometimes it feels like he's still here, in the spaces I didn't notice, in the silence between moments." I looked up at her, trying to process the weight of that admission. She wasn't asking for comfort, and she didn't want me to fix anything. She just needed someone to acknowledge it with her, silently, without judgment. I realized then how carefully she guarded herself, how much she carried under that calm, composed surface. "Was it long ago?" I asked softly. "More than 20 years," she replied. Her eyes flicked toward the envelope again, lingering on the handwriting, the creases in the paper, the past she carried in such a small, tangible thing. "I loved him in ways I didn't know how to contain. And I lost him." I felt a strange ache in my chest, not just for her, but for the weight of loss she had kept tucked away. My mind flashed to all the ways she had seemed unreachable, distant yet magnetic. And suddenly, the way she looked at me, cautious, searching, hesitant, made sense. She had a history of love, heartbreak, and careful guarding. And somehow, despite all that, she let me see a sliver of it. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't say the things I wanted to, not yet. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence between us carry the weight of her confession. Then she did something small but seismic. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, and in that tiny motion, I felt the shift. The air between us thickened, charged with something I couldn't name. Vulnerability, trust, desire, it all mingled in that quiet gesture. For the first time, I realized that the history she carried wasn't a wall to keep me out. It was a map of the person she had become, the woman I had been drawn to since the first moment in the bookstore. And in that still, charged space, I understood nothing would ever feel the same again. And as she turned to leave, the envelope tucked under her arm, I found myself watching her back, heart tugged, mind unsettled, knowing that something had just shifted, quietly, irreversibly. It was late afternoon when she asked me to help rearrange the back office. The sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, casting lines across the floor, and the room smelled faintly of cardboard and old paper. Somehow, even in this mundane task, the air felt charged. We worked side by side, shifting boxes and sorting invoices, our movements efficient but layered with unspoken awareness. I noticed the small things, the way her fingers lingered on a box before lifting it, the soft hum she made when a folder slipped, the way her hair fell over one shoulder and refused to stay tucked back. Every little motion seemed magnified in the quiet of the office. At one point, our hands brushed while reaching for the same stack of invoices. I froze, heart thudding, not wanting to overstep, but unable to pull away immediately. She glanced at me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, and then looked away quickly, busying herself with the papers as if nothing had happened. "Sorry," I muttered, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's fine," she replied, voice low, careful, but I caught the slight tremor in her tone. I realized she was just as aware of that small contact as I was. For a while, we continued working in silence, the room filled only with the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, weighted with everything we hadn't said. I kept noticing the little signs of her exhaustion, the faint shadow under her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. I wanted to reach out, to steady her or offer some word of comfort, but I held back. Instead, I let my eyes linger, trying to convey silently that I saw her. Every small detail, every quiet exhaustion, every fragment of herself she let slip through. Then she paused, mid-motion, hands resting on the edge of a box. She didn't look at me. "Sometimes," she said quietly, almost to herself, "I forget what it's like to have someone just notice." Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I swallowed, my own chest tight, and for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to be that someone for her. Not in a grand, dramatic way, just present, attentive, quietly there. We moved closer as we lifted the next box, the space between us shrinking naturally, inevitable. I felt the warmth of her side, the subtle shift in her balance, the soft sound of her breathing near mine. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was electric, intimate, and entirely unavoidable. She let out a soft sigh, and I realized she hadn't been aware of how tense she had been until that moment. I wanted to reach for her hand, to offer some silent reassurance, but I held myself back, savoring the tension, the restraint, the almost touch that left both of us aware of the space between desire and propriety. When the task was done, she stepped back, brushing imaginary dust from her sweater. Our eyes met for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I saw it there. The flicker of something unspoken, fragile, urgent. And then she left the room, and I was left standing, fingers brushing air where hers had been, heart still racing, thinking about how close we had come without ever touching, and how impossibly that small, quiet moment would linger with me. Looking back now, it feels like those days in the bookstore were a different world, intimate, fragile, electric, but never quite ours to claim. I remember the rain, the quiet aisles, her laughter that lingered longer than it should have, and the way I learned to notice things I'd never cared to before. The tilt of her head, the tremor in her hands, the little cracks in her composure that made her human, alive, and achingly real. I didn't end up holding her hand. We didn't kiss in the dim light between the shelves. But somehow, in all those small moments, the near touches, the shared silences, the half-confessions, something shifted in both of us. I learned patience, awareness, and the quiet thrill of caring without possession. She learned that vulnerability could be shared safely, that someone could see her fully without demanding everything. And maybe that's what love really is, or can be, sometimes. Not the grand gestures or the perfect timing, but the tiny, almost imperceptible ways you show up for someone. The glances, the words left unsaid, the restraint that makes a moment burn brighter. I still think about her. Sometimes when I see a streak of gray in someone's hair, sometimes when a poem catches the corner of my eye, sometimes in the quiet between tasks when the world slows down. But I think of her now without longing that twists into ache. It's a warm kind of remembering, a gentle acknowledgement that we shared something rare and unrepeatable, and that it shaped us both in ways we'll carry forward. She's probably unaware of the subtle ripples she left behind, the way a glance or a sigh can echo months later. And maybe that's how all meaningful connections work, a delicate, fleeting gravity, pulling you into yourself as much as toward the other person. I don't know if she feels the same, probably not, but I'm grateful for the way she opened that tiny crack in her world, for the way I got to walk alongside her, even briefly. That's enough. Sometimes, enough is everything. And in that afterglow, I realize, love doesn't have to be claimed or completed to be real. It can exist quietly, in moments, in gestures, in the way someone teaches you to see the world differently. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?